This is a truly special occasion as we hear from a man who's got so much to impart over 5 decades of distinguished service inside our intelligence community. I'm really delighted because there's something in it for everyone. For our students and faculty, you literally have the living, talking, thinking, breathing encyclopedia of the Central Intelligence Agency. For our practitioners, I think Charlie has many lessons to impart, some with scar tissue, learned the hard way, but also the many successes that the community has gone through. And to paraphrase from Samuel Clemens, a.k.a. Mark Twain, whereas history may not repeat itself, it does tend to rhyme. And let's learn from those that have much to impart in terms of what worked, what didn't, and I think it's a unique opportunity to get that historical perspective. And while I'm on the history, I might note that today was the day I believe Khrushchev signed the letter to President Kennedy taking us off the brink of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this was the day. And too few of our students have much recognition of the Cold War, so I think this is an opportunity to hear from someone who lived it and was at the fore of many of the issues. And to our policymakers, and there are many here from inside the interagency, it's to hear what are the tenets to be able to maximize the possibility of success for a community whose men and women are often toiling in the dark. Often you hear about failures, rarely do you hear about successes, but what is that environment? How do you make it most conducive to increase the likelihood of success? And all doing so while remaining true to our principles and our values. But I think that for the most part our policymakers try to micromanage afterwards. I think the best thing they can do is create the environment to make the men and women who do the work succeed and then get out of the way. And then finally, when I first came to Washington, my first real job in Washington was at CSI as a research assistant to Ray Klein and George Carver. Dare I say, 2 legends in the intelligence business. And I love nothing more than having coffee, having lunch, having dinner, and hearing stories. I kept hearing stories about these larger-than-life figures, Wild Bill Donovan, Sherman Kent, Allen Dulles. But there was another name, Jesus Angleton, Casey, the list goes on and on and on, and it was a very colorful set of characters. But there was another name I kept hearing repeated, Charlie Allen, Charlie Allen, Charlie Allen. So when I kept hearing that from 2 people I looked up to and learned so much from, I knew I had to meet this Charlie Allen. And I've had the opportunity to work with Charlie, but for tonight, I think it's a real unique opportunity to hear from someone who has so much to impart. And quite honestly, if you all received his bio and his background, if I were to try to read through that, it would literally be the history of the Central Intelligence Agency, and we'd be here an awful long time. But fair to say, he's literally been in every leadership position, often a Paul Revere in those leadership positions, NIO for counterterrorism, the first one, NIO for warning. He was the first Director of Intelligence for the Counterterrorism Center. He's headed up collection. He's been there, done that. You name it, he's been there and done that. And if he hasn't personally, he was certainly called upon by those who did. So without further ado, Charlie, we're delighted to have you here tonight. Figured about an hour and then some 45 minutes in Q&A, and this is your night. So thank you for joining us, Charlie.
Thank you, Frank. That was much too generous. Really want to thank Frank for this opportunity and for the Homeland Security Policy Institute and for what it stands for and the good work it does. Tonight, I will not talk a lot about Homeland Security per se. I've been lecturing a lot on Homeland Security. I was in Geneva and spoke on Al-Qaeda and the inbound threat to the homeland. I was in London, spoke on Iranian terrorism recently, and spoke at Georgetown, I think, on Homeland Security information last week. But what I want to talk about is sort of a personal story and a personal journey, and I hope you'll bear with me. And it's not that I've want to make myself central to these events, but I was able to observe a lot of events that I think are historic. So I will talk a bit about the Cold War. I will talk about my experiences. I will talk about lessons learned and relearned, and address some of the concerns that I currently have about the state of the community, but I could spend, that's probably a separate lecture. I did spend 51 years in government service. I spent 47 of those at the Central Intelligence Agency, 3 short years at the Department of Homeland Security. I found intelligence rewarding. I've lived it, I've breathed it. I believe it is the heart of U.S. national security. And its objective is to inform, not make policy. You've just heard Frank talk about Sherman Kent, who is the god of all gods when it comes to analysis. He once said, as John McLaughlin often says, intelligence objective is to raise the level of discussion in Washington. I think that's a very wise statement the more I think about it. I always looked at my role as whatever it was it small or large, it was to keep the country safe. And I think that's what we all do. That's what we all think about. I found that leaving the Central Intelligence Agency 5 months ago, disoriented. I turned in my blue badge then. My SCIF, I had a special compartment and information facility in my home. It had been there for 10 years. It was the best SCIF that CIA had. They liked it immensely because it was very secure. That was hard to not go down and get in touch with COSs around the world. I also had the honor of working as deputy program manager of a compartmented program for 5 years. The program is still compartmented. I will not discuss it this evening, but I worked like hell during those years, and Michelle Van Cleve and others, some others know what it was. I was the NIO for counterterrorism during an important period. Something that's not known, actually for 18 months I also concurrently served as the NIO for counter-narcotics. I learned a little bit about drugs and thugs in that. And when Casey gave me that job of NIO for counter-narcotics, he said, that was after he had called me back from the Pentagon to take over the NIO for counterterrorism. He said, on my way out the door, he called me back and says, oh, by the way, you're counter-narcotics. And I said, I don't know a thing about counter-narcotics. He said, read some books. So as my wife was reading novels, I was reading How to Make Heroin, How to Make Cocaine. So that's a true story. During my career, I've watched the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. I saw the morass of Vietnam. I was working on the President's Daily Brief during much of the time, during a couple of years of that time, and it was a very painful process. I worked state-sponsored terrorism, and that's what I know a lot about. I tracked the Iran-Iraq war and gave warning of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, both warning of war and warning of attack, and I'll have more to say about that. I helped the U.S. Air Force Checkmate, which is a famous little group, select targets during Desert Storm, where we supported the Black Hole and General David Deptula over in the Black Hole. That was we hit a lot of targets. We hit one I didn't want to hit, the Alfredos bunker, and between Jack Leidy and myself, I think we shared 50-50 responsibility for hitting that bunker, which is written up if you've read the books on the war. I aggressively worked collection against Al-Qaeda before I got George Tenet's famous war memo. I was an addressee. I put it aside and said, well, we're doing this. I did not find everybody took that memo quite with the same energy that I and some of my staff did. I'm still personally dismayed by our collective failure to warn of 9/11. I had many meetings of the collection board and others, including some senior people from NSA, where we said, the attack is coming. We warned the hell out of the world, particularly our military brethren, to button up. The one place we didn't look was here at home, so I feel a personal failure there that still bothers me deeply. I drove the intelligence community hard against Al-Qaeda. The idea was find them and kill them if we could. I worked for Iraqi WMD, and of course we worked extremely hard. That was when CENTCOM wanted NTM and that's National Technical Means for those that don't know what that stands for, and wanted every capability of NTM. for military targets, and I wanted to work WMD because Condoleezza Rice had told George Tenet, you've got to use NTM for WMD as well as military targets. I remember Jeff Kimmons, a good friend of mine, when he was a J2, he sent 4 P4s to Glenn Schaefer, the J2, that's personal FAR, complaining about me personally, getting time of NTM capabilities. And Glenn Schaefer would call me on the gray line, which is a secure line, and say, well, we got another P4 from Jeff Kimmons. We'll work together write a response. So I always remember Glenn Schaefer and his help there, because we had to divide our efforts at that time. We had some limited capabilities. Also worked to build an intelligence capability at DHS. When I was on presidential appointment, went there in late '05. And worked at the guidance and direction of Secretary Chertoff, whom I continue to serve because I'm a principal in the Chertoff group, where he is a co-managing principal. He's a brilliant man. He's a man of great honor, great ethics. It's a tremendous opportunity to work for the Secretary in the private sector. I do remember very much, and I can't tell you all the details, in late July 2006, when it became apparent that there was a major plot that rivaled 9/11 against the United States. And I remember the hair on the back of my head rising when I knew the full extent of what was going on. I worked along with the rest of with a small number of people, because the number cleared in the Department of Homeland Security was only 5. Only 5. But we worked with Secretary Chertoff, and as the United Kingdom moved to take down the cell in London and elsewhere, the Secretary Chertoff sort of took command. As Congressman King at the time said, Secretary Chertoff is a quarterback for the United States right now. Let's all take a big, deep breath and follow his guidance. Those are just some of the things that flood over me as I think about this. Let me talk about the Cold War a little bit. And I hope that some of this will be meaningful to you. I want you to understand that at times there was real fear during the Cold War. The threat of nuclear war, as Jim Woolsey always said, was very remote during the Cold War. But there were a number of cases that it wasn't remote. The U.S. objective, of course, was to contain the Soviet Union under President Reagan. There was a focused effort to roll back the Soviet Union. I remember driving out of CIA the day he announced $1 trillion defense buildup, because there were a lot of dollars in there for intelligence, and that was a great feeling. I felt strongly that. Because the Soviet Union in 1981-82 was in deep decline politically, economically, and I think to a greater degree than we thought, even militarily. I began my career working on Berlin tunnel issues. We tunneled into the Russian sector of Berlin. If you've ever been to Berlin when it was divided, I know Don and others have been there. We worked on documents. As you know, the Russian KGB knew about this because of a British spy named Blake. But it was not certain. It was some months before they rolled it up, because I don't think it really trickled down. And we got a lot of valuable information. We also got critical information from a Colonel Oleg Penkovsky. I worked on his papers. He was a famous GRU officer, offered his services to the British and to the Americans. We almost missed that. The British, thank God, took him in, and we worked that jointly. I had the honor of knowing his case officer at the time. He provided critical information during the Cuban Missile Crisis that we knew with certitude: Soviet strategic capabilities to conduct transcontinental attack. We also knew Moscow's command and control system. We essentially had the Red Book, the Red Phone of the Kremlin. You cannot overstate the value of Penkovsky, and I know that BBC and others have been doing work on Penkovsky. Gordon Carrera, who's a BBC correspondent. We also ought to think very strongly about the magnificent technical intelligence we had during that period. The U-2, the Dragon Lady. I don't know how many of you ever had the honor of meeting Kelly Johnson, but I did. I had lunch with him once. Famous developer at the Skunk Works in Burbank. It's Palmdale now, but it was in Burbank when he was doing it. 9 months after he was given the go-ahead, the U-2 was flying in prototype. That's magnificent. That's magnificent when you consider the acquisition problems of today. The AA-12, which was a CIA designation, because both U-2 and the SR-71 Blackbird were initially developed by CIA and acquisition. Again, Kelly Johnson had it flying in 16 months. I hope all of you know about Francis Gary Powers, because I asked a very educated young woman the other day if she ever heard of Francis Gary Powers. She had not. His aircraft, as you know, U-2 was shot down on 1 May 1916, blew up a summit that was occurring. So I would hope that all of you think about that. And the Corona program. I hope you all remember those days. This was to obtain imagery from space. We had 13 consecutive failures of trying to launch and get imagery from space. 13 consecutive failures. The 14th worked. That shows where we were in those days and our determination to succeed. And I thought that was great. And during the Cold War, we had detailed information on Soviet strategic forces. Not always at all times, but during critical periods, we knew where their ICBM fields were. We knew where their SLBMs. We had trouble following their mobile ICBMs. I will give you credit for that. Long-range aviation. When those Tu-95s flew, we weren't surprised. We were surprised in recent years, and that's another matter. I got a medal from Northcom, gave me a medal, NORAD gave me a medal for finding new ways to detect the movements of the bears, and that was only about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. We knew the Warsaw Conventional Forces, the APCs. What's an APC? It's Armored Personnel Carrier. If they pulled them out of sheds, we knew about it because we had technical intelligence that was really good. That's the reason I really do not like the book called Legacy of Ashes. Tim Weiner in that book is dismissive of the U-2 and its value, as well as some of the following capabilities. He said CIA did not have sufficient human resources in the Kremlin. Well, he's right. But he had little understanding of the totality of U.S. intelligence efforts. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was mentioned. The Cuban Missile Crisis was 13 days in October, and Frank's history is spot on. It was more dangerous than the Middle East War of October 1973 or the 7/8/1983 Able Archer episode. I hope all of you have read about that, at least some of you have. As a young officer, I was called on by the Deputy Director of Intelligence to sit on a little task force to plan the new Cuba, the new government that would be installed after the 82nd Airborne and others took down Fidel Castro. That was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. We worked essentially around the clock to do that. It's sort of ironic, though, when you think about it. CIA's Board of National Estimates had made an estimate in September 1962 that Moscow would not introduce offensive missiles outside of the Warsaw Pact. At the same time the estimate was completed, the missiles were already flowing to Cuba. John McCone was a great hero. I never knew John McCone, he never knew me. But he was a great DCI, and the classified history written by CIA is brilliant on John McCone. He kept insisting that U-2 flights over Cuba. Kept insisting. He says, they're building SA-2s. Why aren't they building SA-2s? They're building them to protect something, which seems pretty logical. And he was right. On a U-2 flight, we got back film, as you all know, and we found SS-4 and SS-5 intermediate ballistic missiles in Cuba. We know the cordon sanitaire that President Kennedy drew around that. But I do know, and I do want to let particularly the students know just the fear that we had at CIA that we were on the brink of nuclear war. When Major Anderson's U-2 was shot down on the island on a Thursday night, the night stood still. The Joint Chiefs of Staff directed the Strategic Air Command to go to DEFCON 2. And boy, were we dispersed. Those big B-52s, they have an acronym for them I won't use, which, you know what it is, which was every place. They even had one at Dulles Airport, which had not opened at the time, where they had a crew and the ground crew ready, loaded with nuclear weapons to attack. And if you ever met SAC pilots, rest assured, they would have gotten through whatever defenses there were. I've met a lot of SAC pilots in my time, spent time with they would have dropped those nuclear weapons if directed. I cannot begin to tell you the relief we felt on a Sunday morning when we had this ticker, FBIS ticker, begin to spew forth a statement from the Kremlin carried by task and broadcast over radio Moscow, accepting the compromise that was proposed by President Kennedy. As you know, he took the less hostile letter from Khrushchev, and the Russians agreed to move missiles from Cuba. We agreed to move them from Turkey. So I will say this, that Moscow, I think, recognized its overreach. It continued its effort at expansionism, and wherever Russian KGB officers went, CIA officers or some of our allied intelligence officers showed up. I remember KGB officers showing up in Western Samoa. We sent an Australian there to look after them. So wherever they were, we were. So this, and they used proxies. You know, many of you may have forgotten how large the Cuban force was to support the MPLA in Angola, and the fact that they had tens of thousands of Cuban forces there over a period of years. And in fact, Cuba maintained forces in Angola until 1991. Let's talk a little bit about the war, the October 1973 war, where events spiraled almost out of control. Where Sadat and President Assad of Syria believed the only way they could change, the only way they can do a game changer, as we call it today, was by a joint attack on Israeli forces. You remember things were a little different in those days. The Israelis held the Sinai Peninsula, and they held the Golan Heights. As a result of the Six-Day War in 1967, we had a brilliant guy, brilliant leader, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan. They also seized East Berlin and the West Bank all the way to the River Jordan, if you've ever been out in the West Bank. We were concerned by exercises that were occurring by Syrian and Egyptian forces along the fronts, Sinai and Golan. And I was in charge of military production at the time for the agency, for current reporting. Henry Kissinger was worried. He sent cables out. We sent cables out to our chiefs of station in Tel Aviv, Cairo, Damascus, to see if there was a potential for hostilities in the Middle East. And the answer was no. We spoke to the Israelis and all the services involved, as Bill Murray would know. And they said, well, no, they dare not attack us. We beat them in 6 days. The last time, they won't do this. I was put to bed, and this is sort of ironic. I put to bed the President's Daily Brief for the 5th of October, 1973. And it said, among other things, that the Syrian and Egyptian exercises appear to be more realistic than normal, but that hostilities were not likely. I remember being told before leaving CIA's Operations Center, about 2,000 hours that evening, that the military wing of Fatah, the largest faction of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was on full alert. I almost started calling people in, but I decided to go home. At 0300 hours, I received a call from John Paisley, another famous CIA officer who died under somewhat mysterious circumstances, called me to inform me that Golda Meir had called Kissinger to say that Israel had A1 information, that's a code word for something I won't talk about, that Israel would be attacked in 4 hours by the combined armies of Syria and Egypt. Because it takes Tel Aviv 72 hours to mobilize, the attack could not be blunted. Paisley directed I go report to Dick Lehman, a man for whom I worked for 10 years directly, who was head of current intelligence of CIA, a very famous officer and chair of the Watch Committee. We met at the Pentagon. It was a comedy when we met there, because we had action officers rushing in and out to Dick Lehman and the Watch Committee, talking about dogfights over the Golan, attacks by the Egyptian forces across the Suez Canal. Lehman finally just stood up and said, "Gentlemen, there were no women there, I will note. Let's adjourn and go back to our respective office. We can do no good here." Well, you know the rest of the story. You know how the Israelis suffered the first 4 days in particular. And the SA-6, Soviet SA-6s took a heavy toll on their aircraft until the U.S. gave them countermeasures. And the air bridge which flew, that the United States, when it gets its mind up, can do magnificent things. About every 10 minutes, a U.S. aircraft was landing with supplies at Ben Gurion Airport. It was amazing. I served as Deputy Chief of CIA's Task Force. Again, I got the brass ring. I didn't ask for it. They called me in, Colby and others, and said, you know, you're the deputy chief. Dick Kovar, another famous officer, was the chief. I did all the military reporting every 4 hours. We turned out situation reports, president's daily briefs, interpretive articles. We stuffed Colby every time he went rushing downtown. I was so exhausted on the 21st day, which was the last day, that Ed Proctor, CIA's Deputy Director of Intelligence, came to see me late in the evening. He finally looked at me and says, Charlie, you can go to sleep. I'll edit the sit rep. It was a very memorable time. I did sleep. He did edit it. One of the things, the lessons learned, is that we saw warhead vans in Egypt. We had tried but not detected any movement of nuclear weapons out of the Soviet Union into the Middle East. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we learned that nuclear warheads were in Egypt just as they had been in Cuba in 1962. That's pretty chilling when you think about the risks that the Russians took in putting nuclear warheads, not just the vans, but the warheads inside the vans. I will say that some of our officers, like Fritz Ermarth and others, always believed that there were warheads in Egypt. No one else exactly believed it at the time. Well, we had a failure in the West not only to penetrate deeply into Egypt and Syria decision-making, but we had a failure to issue any warning at all. I felt personally seared by the event since I was overall managing the current production and judgments. And I carried that with me when I was the NIO for Counterterrorism and Warning. Bob Gates once said at a National Foreign Intelligence Board meeting where warning was discussed that regional analysts are likely to be the last to recognize abrupt discontinuity. That is a precise quote from Bob Gates, and I don't know whether he remembers making it, but I do. I carried it with me. So, you know, we should have sounded the klaxon in September. We had this great national, we had this this view that this was very realistic, but we did not get it right. We should have sounded the klaxon when the Russians, the Soviets, pulled out all their dependents from Cairo and Damascus a week before hostilities broke out. Now, to me, that should have told us something. The bells should have rung very hard, but it didn't, surprisingly. And reform and warning should have come from inside the leadership of CIA and the DCI, but it didn't. It came from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, who in 1978, after HIPSI was formed, did a study and recommended and insisted on establishing the position of National Intelligence Officer for Warning. I'd like to talk a little bit about state-sponsored terrorism as I wander through my personal journey. In 1985, the DCI Casey directed I returned from that compartmented program in the Pentagon, where I was deputy program manager of a huge acquisition effort. And he said, you're the NIO for Warning and also the NIO for Counter-Narcotics, as I said. Despite Reagan's bold statements during his campaign in 1980, we had great difficulty in combating terrorism at that time. The U.S. Embassy in Beirut was bombed in April 1983, a bombing led by Hezbollah, a guy named Imad Magnia, which killed Robert Ames, Bob Ames, a friend of mine, and one of CIA's most distinguished experts in the Middle East. It wiped out the entire station except for one officer whom I helped retire years later. U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut were bombed, again by Hezbollah, again by Magnia, on 23 October 1983, killing 241 Marines. You got to remember, 59 French commandos died a few minutes later because they were almost consecutive bombings by Hezbollah. The chief of station in Beirut, Bill Buckley, whom I knew when he was head of Special Operations Group at CIA, was kidnapped along with other Americans, again by Hezbollah and Magnia. Buckley was tortured and murdered. He died in 1984. In June 1985, I was on a trip to Europe when TWA-847 was hijacked, again by Hezbollah, and the body of Navy diver Robert Steedham was dumped on the tarmac at Beirut International Airport. Reagan's statement that to the world that terrorists can run but can't hide looked pretty hollow. Then came the Achille Lauro. And the U.S. response to the Achille Lauro began to change the perceptions of the United States on terrorism. I happened to play a role in that. Again, the brass ring came around. I was sitting on my computer. I received it on a IT system that was very crude at the time called Flashboard, a message from a Navy commander, AG in Naval Intelligence, saying that terrorists had hijacked a ship, a cruise ship in the Mediterranean. I sent a note back to Jerry saying, well, what's the size of this ship, which was called the Achille Lauro? He said, I don't know, but it's bigger than the Love Boat, which was a popular television program at the time. We had repeated meetings at the White House over the next 24 hours. I went with Director Casey to a meeting at the Situation Room, which was presided over personally by Ronald Reagan. He was briefed by Robert McFarland, DCI Casey, JCS Chairman Admiral Crowell. The President gave the order that the ship be taken down by a special Navy SEAL team unit that had flown into the area under the leadership of Carl Steiner, a good friend. He was commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. The last words spoken by President Reagan at the meeting to Admiral Crowell were 3 words. And he got up and left. He said, take no prisoners. He said, well, I guess 4 words. Admiral, take no prisoners. The President was infuriated that the Palestine Liberation Front hijackers, not Hezbollah, had killed an elderly American passenger named Leon Klinghoffer and thrown his body over the side of the ship. Well, the U.S. Navy, amazingly, had trouble finding the Achille Lauro in the Mediterranean. They could tell you where every Russian ship and sub was, but they could not tell you where all these other commercial ships were. The Israelis found it, Israeli missile patrol boats. I remember Bob Gates, standing with Bob Gates while he was talking to Mike Armacost, who was yelling, why can't you find the Achille Lauro? Why can't the Navy find it? Well, the Israelis found it. The ship put into Port Said. We thought we had lost an opportunity to get at the hijackers because the Egyptian government, negotiating with Arafat and PLF leader Abbas, that was Abu Abbas, who was leader of the Palestinian Liberation Front, which was a splinter group within the PLF, clearly was not going to, Egypt clearly was not going to turn the hijackers over to the United States. Just as we were expressing frustration over being thwarted once again, a deputy of mine saw some intelligence that hijackers were likely to be given safe passage on an Egyptian 737 aircraft to Libya to join Palestinian elements there. I relayed this information to a rather famous name, Lieutenant Colonel Ollie North, the NSC officer responsible for counterterrorism. For the next 72 hours, we had no sleep. The terrorist event occurred before the establishment of CIA's Counterterrorism Center. Thus, my office became an operations center with several secure gray lines being brought in. I was in touch with Alvin Moreau, now deceased, who was Art Moreau, who was director of Joint Staff at the JCS. Jim Yank Dorsey, who was a J3 over at UConn, a great friend of mine. Deputy National Security Advisor John Poindexter, all the leadership in the CIA, and eventually a host of lawyers from the Department of Justice who were planning to extradite the hijackers to the United States. I was sort of a one-man band with a couple of deputies. Well, you know the rest of the story. UCOM and the 6th Fleet set up a picket of F-14s from USS Saratoga, which proceeded to search a commercial airline route, found the Egyptian 737 flying towards Libya. The American Tomcat pilots flashed their lights and forced the Egyptian aircraft to land at Sigonella, which is a NATO base on Sicily. Carl Steiner's C-141, which had been in the area, filled with Navy SEALs, landed directly behind the Boeing aircraft as it landed at Sigonella. And I will not tell you all the details of the standoff between the SEALs, U.S. Navy SEALs, and the Carabinieri. Let me be said, when it was briefed in detail in my presence to Frank Carlucci by the people who were on the ground at Sigonella, it was within a hair of being an absolute hellacious firefight between the Carabinieri and our SEALs. And I don't know who would have won because Carabinieri was heavily armed and they're very tough. Well, we got 4 of the hijackers off the aircraft. Abu Abbas stayed on board the 737. The 737 abruptly left Leonardo da Vinci International Airport. Steiner ordered a JSOC chase plane to take off from a taxiway, not from a runway, and follow the 737 into Rome, landing behind it. I could go on for a long time about this. Abu Abbas was helped by the Italians and by the Egyptians to escape. He had dressed up as a member, as a part of a crew of Egyptian airliners, ended up in Dubrovnik, Yugoslavia. The Italian government, headed by Prime Minister Craxi, collapsed because of the blatant intrusion by the United States onto the sovereign territory of Italy, which was true. And the Italians were pretty angry that there was no strong Italian response. The United States, though, had acted decisively to capture the hijackers. Americans felt good about the administration's pledge to strike hard at terrorism. I had a good feeling about the events overall. I have a nice letter from Ronald Reagan in a box somewhere, complimenting me on my efforts to coordinate intelligence across the intelligence community. But we knew we had a lot of work to do. We could not operate from a makeshift command post in the office of the NIO for Counterterrorism. Already the National Commission for Combating Terrorism, which was formed after the hijacking of TW-847, chaired by Vice President at the time, George Herbert Walker Bush, was completing its work. Among the Commission's 40-plus recommendations was the need to form a counterterrorism fusion center. Many of the Commission's recommendations were implemented. Some of them are still there and highly compartmented. And CTC came into existence under the leadership of a guy named Dewey Claridge, a very legendary officer. DCI Casey named me as, in addition to my job as NIO, as Deputy Chief of the CTC for Intelligence. Fred Turco, another famous CIA officer, was Chief of Ops. He was COPS. Well, the good thing about this is that Ollie North and I spoke at the Army War College the week following the capture of the 4 hijackers. Ollie was squirming, didn't want to go up when we thought the hijackers were going to get away, but he was happy to go with us when we went up. But the moment we walked on the stage at Carlisle Barracks, there was no introduction, none, because the students to a person, every one of them, stood and applauded for 5 minutes. It was a very emotional moment for me, particularly brought on by absolute sleep deprivation for 7 days. It was a good time. We also continued our assault on state-sponsored terrorism in early 1986, following the bombing of the Babel Disco bombing in Berlin. Killed an American soldier and a Turkish woman. We had very hard evidence that the Libyan External Security Organization conducted the bombing. I was at the office at CTC late one evening when the word came of the Babel Disco bombing. I called Turco, who was en route home, to his home. He returned. I remember going to the White House the next day with the Deputy Director of Operations, I think it was Bert Dunn at the time, to brief John Poindexter on the attack. After receiving the briefing, Poindexter left to see the President in the Oval Office. So we sat there and waited anxiously. We thought it'd be a long time, but John surprisingly returned in 15 minutes and stated that President Reagan had directed the JCS to attack terrorist targets in Libya. And he wanted the attack to occur within a week. DCI Casey and Gates directed me as the NIO to select the targets to strike in Libya in coordination with the J2 JCS. I was supported by 2 CIA splendid officers on the Middle East. We developed a list of 10 targets. The J2 at the time, a great man named Tom Brooks, Rear Admiral, developed a list of 10 as well. DOD named this operation El Dorado Canyon, very famous. The 2 lists did not correspond because my list had the head of the snake, which is Azizia Barracks, where Gaddafi resided. Tom had more conventional, Tom's officers had selected more conventional military facilities. Captain, later Vice Admiral Jim Stark at the NSC was very unhappy. He said, the last thing we need is a fight between CIA and U.S. military intelligence over targeting. I said, no problem, Jim, he was a good friend. So I hosted Tom Brooks out at Langley, and within an hour we had an agreement. I got most of my targets on the list. Tom got a few of his. There's not a finer person around than Tom Brooks. He recognized that we wanted to strike directly against Gaddafi's terrorist infrastructure, and that's what we did. I do remember a rather amusing story, receiving a call on the Gray Line from the Joint Strategic Targeting Staff at SAC, which is very famous, from a colonel saying, I want the BE number for this place where Gaddafi lives, Azizia Barracks. I said, there is no BE number because we've never targeted Gaddafi's walled compound. Well, SAC developed one in a hurry. I could talk about this for a long time, but one of the things that was sort of amusing to me was that President Reagan insisted we not tell the press or the Congress or give any hint of this attack until minutes before. We didn't tell the press at all. We told the Congress leadership a few minutes before. The FB-111s at Lakenheath had left long before the congressmen and women arrived at the White House. So it was a surprise, and the bombing results were a disappointment, and that's another story. And Gaddafi eventually did strike back with Pan Am 103 and UTA 722, the French aircraft. But there is a postscript in that affected me. I was flying into Iraq on 8 March 2004. Abu Abbas had eventually found his way to Baghdad, where Saddam had given him refuge. And American soldiers picked him up in Operation Iraqi Freedom and put him in Camp Cropper, which some of you I know have seen. And the day I landed, Abu Abbas died. So I felt great satisfaction to know that this hideous individual was gone. So I want to talk just a little bit about warning. You know the time is moving on, but I was made the NIO for warning in February 1988. Again, the brass ring came around in a way that was not foreseen because I was embroiled in the Iran-Contra affair indirectly. Never a target, always a witness. We could see the accelerating collapse of the Soviet Union, the coup, the abortive coup that occurred in August of '91. I and my staff forecast that along with others. I won't elaborate on this, but one of the things that is ironic about this, I did the last National Intelligence Estimate on warning of war in Europe. I chaired it, had some great officers from the CIA and from the community working on it. I believe that we had much longer warning times, and I had a major battle with the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Army. I think Colonel Perdue was his name, later ambassador, great man. Anyway, they would not agree to long warning times. They also thought that the group of Soviet forces, Germany, could do a standing start attack on Berlin. I rejected all that. We fought all summer. Finally, they did concede. We did get longer warning times. We did the last warning of war in Europe. I went to Europe in October to brief the Americans on the estimate. Then I went back in November after the wall had come down to brief the military committee of NATO. The ironic thing was, and Michel Van Cleve will appreciate this, is that before I briefed either the Americans in Europe or NATO allies, and if you ever brief the military committee, it's a vast room with more uniforms you've ever seen in your life and more flag rank officers. A guy named Aldrich Ames had sent the estimate to Moscow, so there we are. So it was not a surprise to the Kremlin. I'd like to talk about Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and talk about the community's failure to warn of major historic strategic breakpoints. We seem to be unable to do this. When I was the NIO for warning, I had a staff down near the J2 in the Pentagon. J2 kept trying to get rid of it, but I always insisted we keep it there. And near Checkmate, which was obviously the air staff, the air planning staff. I had a small staff at Langley, so I had offices in both the Pentagon and at Langley. It was good. I saw Saddam Hussein as a real threat to the United States, and a real threat to the Middle East, and a real strategic breakpoint. On 1 April 1990, he said he made a major speech, and he intended to burn Israel with binary chemical weapons. I know of no one who read that speech as many times as I did. I read it again and again over the following days. Maybe the Israelis read it more than I did, but I read it a great deal. I had concluded that following Iraq's victory, after 8 years over Iran in 1988, we were facing an extremely dangerous enemy in Saddam Hussein, and that he had expansionist intentions. and it wasn't long in coming. My staff and I were reading the propaganda emanating from Baghdad through May and June 1991. We saw Iraqi rhetoric against the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait increase. It was a wonderful day on 17 July 1990. I arrived at 0500 hours, that's when I arrived at the agency, in the CIA Operations Center, only to be told there was a curious report that the Republican Guard forces were moving south towards southern Iraq. And if you've been out to Iraq, they have good highways. I thought this was significant because Saddam had accused Kuwait of stealing oil from the Ramallah oil field, which traveled both Kuwait and Iraq, and also the UAE profiting from the sale of Iraqi war. I raised this issue strongly at the National Intelligence Council, since I was the NIO as a member of the council, only to be told by the NIO for Near East South Asia that Iraq lacked liquidity at the time and that these were empty threats, and that I should not worry. The buildup increased over the next several days. The Iraqi military borrowed vehicles from the civil economy to move Republican Guard forces equipment and ammunition, a powerful indicator that the Iraqi military was not bluffing. I drove collection hard, drove overhead systems, studied the impressive logistics buildup in southern Iraq. I judged the Republican Guard forces only operated in offensive and counteroffensive forces, otherwise we used the regular army. Given the number of divisions involved, I wrote Warning of War on the 24th of July 1990 that Saddam intended to attack and occupy all of Kuwait. My warning was ignored at CIA, elsewhere in the intelligence community. I went down to see Richard Haas, the Special Assistant of the President for Near East and South Asian Affairs. Haas listened closely, but he clearly did not believe that a major invasion of Kuwait was imminent. I raised warning at State, where Dick Clark, Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs, was willing to listen. And he passed my warning on immediately to Bob Kimmett, the Undersecretary for Policy. Meanwhile, the White House and others in DOD and State were listening to King Hussein of Jordan, President Mubarak of Egypt, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, and even the Emir of Kuwait. All said that Saddam had told them he had no intention to attack Kuwait or to invade Kuwait. So, and you kept hearing this phrase from high policy people, and I'll name them, that Arab states do not invade other Arab states. Well, I'd issued a warning of war, On 1 August, I came in at 500. I saw Iraqi tanks carefully lined up along the Kuwaiti border, 200 yards apart. I went through channels in my own agency, was rebuffed by the regional analyst on duty with the Director of Intelligence. The division chief of that division of Near East South Asia could not be disturbed because he was holding a meeting on personnel. I called everyone in town that I could. I talked to the J5's gatekeeper, a bird colonel, who assured me that Lieutenant General Lee Butler, who was J5 Plans and Policy and Plans, could not be disturbed because he was preparing to brief in the tank. I said, well, what's the subject? He said, NATO. I told him that was the wrong subject and dictated a note to pass to Lee, which bluntly said an attack was coming into Kuwait in full force. The Republican Guards had their soft forces, their special operation forces, and helicopter assault forces ready to go. The note, of course, never got to Lee. Gatekeepers rule in this town, if you don't know that. I sent a junior officer from my National Warning Staff to see the J-33, who will remain nameless, who refused to see him because he was too junior. I then sent a senior GS-15 DIA officer seconded to my staff, and the J-33 did talk to him, but told him that he was wrong, that it was not occurred. I then leaped in a car and went to the White House, where I saw the Special Assistant for Intelligence Programs, who believed me. He asked for an audience with Haas, so we went over to see Haas. Richard said he had 10 minutes. So we laid out on the line what was occurring, the build-up, the indicators were powerful, and Haas thanked me and said he had to move on. So as I left, I raised my voice very loud, and I said to Richard, I can give you no further warning, the attack is coming. Richard, to his credit, did call Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor, and tell him my visit. but he did not believe a major attack would occur. And he sort of apologizes to me in War of Choice, War of Necessity, War of Choice. If you've read that, there's two references where he calls me crusty. So I guess that's about as far as we go. I won't go on because, you know, there's a lot of things that occurred. For example, I went back. I issued warning of attack, which says, you know, you can't do anything if the attack's coming. Dick Clark called me as I got home that evening at $1,800 because I was angry. And he said the ambassador in Kuwait was calling that Iraqi tanks were knocking down custom booths on the Kuwait's border, and enemy helicopters were at Kuwait's International Airport. So I called CIA's Operations Center immediately. And I said, what's happening? They said, nothing. I said, well, the Noi one is going to ring, so you should get prepared because the attack is coming full force. And just in the background, I could hear the Noi one ring. This is an emergency phone where you get all the operations centers talking together. So what were the NICS and DCI management's response to the warning? Well, I was told I'd behaved badly, that I'd gone recklessly out of channels without informing my superiors, and another assignment would be in the offing, which is a code word for banishment to some remote intelligence community gulag. In fact, the NIC leadership was preparing a memorandum. I got copies from my friends recommending that DCI abolish the post of the NIOW, and they said instead of little staff that would help the regional NIOs to look at intelligence gaps and support regional NIOs. Well, that wasn't to be. I had friends on Capitol Hill who heard the rumors, Senator Bourne among others, and a staff director up there named George Tenet. I didn't talk to them. I never went to them. But they got it from my friends, and they made it clear that the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence would not tolerate the abolishment of its position. And the New York Times wrote an article, a guy named Wise, who wrote a very nice article talking about how the CIA had sidelined its Cassandra. So, but on 17 July, as the T-Lambs were streaking to Baghdad, I was summoned to DCI Webster's office, where Judge Webster and I had a long talk about intelligence warning. He said he had no intention of abolishing the position. I'm not sure it ever reached his desk, and he wanted to make sure that I knew it. Well, what were the history lessons here? Well, we missed the Middle East War of 1973 completely. Prodded by the Congress in reform, we did some reform in warning, gave it somewhat greater prominence. We gave warning of war and warning of attack, an invasion of Kuwait, and CIA management wanted to abolish, at some levels, wanted to abolish the position and dismantle the agency of warning capabilities. I still think that warning is a major problem in this country. And I will not talk very much about my position as assistant DCI for collection. It was a great job. Again, it came about because we failed to warn. On 11 through 13 May 1998, India tested weapons in the Thar Desert. The BJP party had run on a number of issues, as a very conservative party, but it said, if elected, it intended to develop an Indian nuclear arsenal. You would have thought that that would have roused the intelligence community to real energy and warning, but it didn't. And we gave no warning. And of course, the Pakistanis responded later that month in May with their own tests. David Jeremiah, one of the great men of this country, Admiral David Jeremiah, 4-star, brilliant man, along with an associate named Howard Shue, who was always there with David, wrote a short report for Model and Clarity. He said there had to be more red teaming, there had to be more organized ways of collecting, and we had to fill the positions created by the Congress of Assistant Director of Central Intelligence for Analysis, Collection, and Administration. And they were. And Joan Dempsey, who was Deputy Director of Central Intelligence at the time for Community Management, was a great supporter of doing this. I had the great honor of working for 7 years at the elbow of George Tenet and the intelligence community. Today, the National Intelligence Collection Board under Glenn Gaffney remains a strong capability. It really did mean a big difference. In the post-Cold War, I was very concerned about the intelligence community because CIA alone took a 24% cut in personnel mandated by the Office of Management and Budget, and we also lost 24% in our budget. Billions of dollars in real terms were cut from the overall CIA and from the intelligence community. The military intelligence was really shredded. 1 out of every 3 positions was abolished. 1 out of every 3. We lost the ability to build certain systems, particularly NTM systems. It led to a lot of adventures, such as the open architecture for the future imagery architecture, which I can't discuss in real detail, but that, if you read the New York Times and Washington Post, that was a real disaster. We did not react well in that post-Cold War. And since then, of course, we had September 11th and a lot of commissions. The 9/11 Commission, the WMD Commission, and the creation of the Director of National Intelligence. It's no secret that I opposed the creation of the Director of National Intelligence and spoke strongly to a lot of people before the law was passed, but I was one voice. I don't advocate walking the cat back. The DNI is there. The office needs to work. I do believe the DNI, and if he were here, I would say he would agree it's a work in progress, and improvements can be made to make it more effective. All 3 DNIs have been friends of mine, so none of my comments on this are personal. Admiral Ambassador Negroponte, Admiral McConnell, and now Admiral Blair, I think, are all trying to do what's right, but there needs to be greater integration, and we need a lean DNI. And the DNI is not a COCOM, he's not a czar, he's more like a chief operating officer that pulls the community together, first among equals, to make that happen. He or she who runs, who becomes a DNI. I think McConnell did some good things in getting the updated Federal Intelligence Surveillance Court Act in 1978 updated and modernized. He worked to amend Executive Order 12333, which lays out the roles and missions of the intelligence community agencies. At DHS, I worked very hard to get our mission defined when I was under Secretary Chertoff. And above all, McConnell did begin the Comprehensive National Cyber Initiative, which President Bush became very engaged in, which President Obama has declared to be a very high national priority. Well, what are the challenges? Well, I'm a dedicated Cassandra, I guess. Just because I'm retired doesn't mean I don't keep the night watch. I do it sort of mentally and emotionally every day. We live in a globalized, complex world where we have a global economic crisis. And we're likely to see further failed states and political upheavals. And where there's failed states, there will be ungoverned areas. And we have ungoverned areas, we know what will happen. I think the most dramatic change in the current workload is the requirement to identify, track, and analyze a stunning number of targets, fuse vast flows of data beyond anything that we can almost imagine. We're talking about teraflops of data. In the 20th century, we could limit our concerns to a few nation states, a few of which could attack us in any way possible. But my great concern today is that we follow data and not content. I feel we're going to be surprised again, as we were in '73 and 1990, if we don't continue to do in-depth analysis. Those who do quick tactical current intelligence to track, identify, track, and analyze targets frequently are rewarded. Those who do the heavy lifting day after day, month after month, are not. And there are some good work going out there against strategic targets, and I'm very aware of some of it. But what I saw in 9/11, we saw a few individuals could achieve really high-order effects from low-order mechanism. And asymmetric warfare is not new. At Agincourt, we had the longbows. We had machine guns introduced in the Civil War, repeating rifles. We should heed the Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, and Terrorism, which forecasts the next asymmetric attack. Whether you believe Senator Graham or Senator Talbot, and Commission members or not, it's one we have to think and worry about. If you read the report entitled World at Risk, you should, because there is a potential for hundreds of thousands of casualties. And we do know that a guy named al-Zawahiri, for 10 years, has been given the responsibility by Osama bin Laden to develop a non-conventional attack capability against the United States, that asymmetric effort. And of course, we know that Osama bin Laden in 1998 said it was a religious duty to develop non-conventional capabilities against al-Qaeda's enemies. I would like to talk a little bit about, and I have about 5 minutes, which I'll finish in 5 minutes, the quality of analysis within the intelligence community. I again think we work bits and data we don't put in perspective to assure the quality of our product. I believe quality assurance falls in the D&I job jar. Chris Kojum, who is the new Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analysis, is a friend of mine. I've known him for a long time. He replaced Tom Fingar, a very able man. We've got to recruit and hold capable people. We've got to train them to do the job, give them the tools and the techniques, and make certain the organizational incentives actually favor quality over quantity, and assure that the production process are explicit quality assurance steps, and those involved in those steps are qualified and motivated. I do believe the D&I has a great job of evaluation. Keith Hall, former director of the NRO and once head of Deputy Director of Central Intelligence for Community Management, always said that DCI and now the D&I have this great evaluation task. And I don't think the D&I thus far has done that to the level it should be done. So I think that, that this is one of the big tasks in front of Chris Kojum and Denny Blair and others who work in the leadership positions of the D&I. Also, the blame game. That seems to be rampant in the United States. In Washington, we have two outcomes: operational and policy successes and intelligence failures. Whenever there's a bad outcome, intelligence is a natural whipping boy. Commissions are established, postmortems are conducted, usually with public fanfare. Sweeping recommendations and legislation follow. Highly sensitive information occasionally is leaked, and damage is done to sources and methods. I do not begrudge the 9/11 and W&D commissions. Some good recommendations came out from them, and the Bush administration implemented many, if not most of them. But I do worry deeply about how we conduct our postmortems or how we look at this. Not many of you may know, but that there were commissions in London and Canberra, Australia. They made changes in SIS. They made changes in how they assessed data at Cabinet Office and the assessment staff under Tim Dowse. They made changes in Canberra on how they did their collection and analysis. It was done quietly. We didn't throw a lot of people under the bus in doing it. And I think we do great harm if we continue to have this very partisan and poisonous way of operating. My third concern involves the potential grave damage that will be done to the CIA as a consequence of recent developments concerning detainees, their alleged treatment and interrogation. I thought that we were putting this behind us. President Obama indicated this early on when he was talking about looking at investigating CIA's interrogation of certain detainees using enhanced interrogation methods. But I have been very concerned in recent months because of the special prosecutor appointed to investigate the destruction of in 2005 by CIA of so-called interrogation tapes. I'm even more concerned when the Attorney General added to the special prosecutor's tabs the investigation of possible abuses by CIA officers who may have exceeded the guidelines issued by the Department of Justice during the previous administration. And then we released a redacted report from former CIA Inspector General John Helgerson, which looked at CIA's interrogations. Unfortunately, the portions not redacted contained verbatim and precise instructions on what CIA could and could not do during the interrogations. I find this extremely disturbing and should be very comforting to our enemies. As far as disciplinary actions, the CIA took some disciplinary actions, as Mike Hayden has said, in a couple of cases where interrogation guidelines were exceeded. And in all cases, those were referred to the U.S. Attorney, a career prosecutor of the Eastern District Court of Virginia, and he declined to pursue any further investigation after reviewing all the materials that were made available also to the Attorney General. My intention here is not to get into the definition of torture or to speak of enhanced interrogations, but to raise a red flag about the chilling message being sent to CIA officers at home and abroad who act under covert action findings approved by the President, the Attorney General, and which are briefed to the Congress. CIA officers, when they are threats to the United States, are expected to conduct missions which by nature are dangerous and risky. I know some of my friends are part of the stars on the wall at the CIA headquarters. The American people look to their government for protection from those who will do us harm. By any measure, the recent administration decisions relating to the actions of CIA involving detainees and interrogations are having a chilling effect on the agency, making it more cautious, less willing to take the risks necessary to acquire information from the hardest targets, and especially extremists who plot daily against this country. I've been abroad recently in several countries. I've talked to some CIA officers, and I'm concerned about their spirit and morale. They're very candid and very direct. Now, I will refer you, as my final comment, to the letter sent in September by 7 previous DCIs to the President, which worried deeply over the actions that were occurring. They were signed not only by people like Mike Hayden, but by Judge Webster, who is a member of the Homeland Security Policy Institute steering committee. That letter sent by the DCIs, 7 of them, is without precedent in my 51 years of government. Thank you. I'll answer any questions.
I'll take advantage of sitting where I am and maybe asking the first question. And I'm somewhat breaking my own rules since we tend to aspire to shed more light than heat on a set of topics. But I want to draw on some of your insights on in your role as NIO for warning and the overall warning portfolio. And is there anyone who's done warning well? Are there other intelligence services and or militaries that perhaps do a better job structurally as well as conceptually in being able to provide the best information to our decision makers? Are there other sectors? I mean, people used to say banking, finance. I think we all know they too are far from getting it right these days. Are there other sectors we can learn from? And then finally, on the Homeland side, is there something the Homeland Security Advisory System should be thinking in terms of what we're gleaning from other entities overseas?
I think KGB does a pretty good job of alerting people. They certainly took their people out of Syria and Egypt when we sat sort of blindly, not truly absorbing it as George Carver. I guess it was Charlie Newhouser, another famous CIA officer, who said, "How could you be so blind, Charlie? You guys really blew it." I do believe that the British are reasonably good at this. They have a very small assessment staff. They have a NIC-like capability. I don't think any service does a good job. The Israelis have learned from their terrible events and their arrogance, their absolute unbelievable arrogance of 1973. I've been to Tel Aviv a few times and talked to them. They set up red teams. They work red teams all the time. They are very good at this, and they're very good at putting their most sensitive operational data together with their military analysts and other analysts in the Mossad, Shin Bet. They probably, but they have a very small world. They don't have to worry about every aspect of the globe as the Americans do. But from their small prism, the Israelis do an excellent job of this. I think we have a lot to learn. I think that I've talked to Peter Lavoie, chairman of the National Intelligence Council. He wants to look at that whole issue of warning, and warning is a discipline again. And I've offered my services to help him. But there are very few people around the world that do it well. Again, it gets back to Bob Gates. And Bob Gates, I think, has a good understanding of this, that where there's abrupt discontinuity, regional analysts and officers seem to be the last to hear it. The chiefs of station in 1973, I read all those cables, came back and said, not to worry, in Cairo and Damascus and Amman and Tel Aviv, and they said, and also Saudi Arabia came back. Henry Kissinger did the right thing in asking for opinions, but the responses, along with all the soothing comments of heads of state, lulled us into a false sense of security.
Michelle, and please identify yourself.
Michelle Band.
Yes, I know you well.
On picking up on this warning point, you taught me a long time ago that the warning cycle is more than an intelligence function, it's a national security decision-making function. So as your experience confirms, the side that requires policymaker engagement and willingness to act even on less than perfect information is an essential part of the whole warning cycle. Which brings us to the real pressing questions of today, the difficulties of warning in the context of our national homeland concerns and our vulnerabilities here at home. Since we have you in a very wonderfully expansive mood tonight, I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the role of domestic intelligence, in particular the FBI, and how the FBI's integration within the intelligence community historically has evolved from your perspective, and where we are today on that very distressing need for domestic intelligence that informs a larger warning and really threat assessment.
That's a great question, Michelle. In my view, leading officials of the DNI and none of the DNIs has really tackled the issue of domestic intelligence. They've pushed it away. John Negroponte, I think, had the best understanding because he served in Mexico City and served in Central America. And he had sort of a sense of it. But I could not get Admiral McConnell, and I haven't really spent time with Danny Blair on it, but they sort of kept it at arm's length. And we have not made a decision on what is domestic intelligence. And I think it has to be addressed. Doesn't mean that we have to have an MI5. RAND Corporation under Greg Treverton did a great study which looked at the pros and cons of that. It was sponsored by Greg Judd, senator from New Hampshire. We spent $1 million. It was conducted under my aegis, but it was hands-off. It was an objective study done by Greg and the RAND Corporation. And it does look at this. I think what we have today, I think, and as a very senior official of the British BSS talked to me about a month ago at some length on domestic intelligence and DHS intelligence, and said, DHS intelligence has to complement the FBI and work across state and local governments and the private sector, and that without a very strong DHS intelligence arm that he felt that the United States was putting itself at risk. As he said, Al-Qaeda has arrived here. He was obviously referring to Zazdi. And he said, we stopped one of the attacks of Al-Qaeda against you, and that was the aviation plot of 9-10 August 2006. The FBI, and I've talked to Bob Mueller and to John Pistol, both of whom I respect and who are friends of mine. And today we have a hybrid situation where intelligence is growing in strength in the FBI. It has come a long way without the courage of Mo Baginski to build the field intelligence groups and to establish, for the first time, an intelligence arm. FBI still remains investigative and case-oriented, which leaves a gap where I think DHS, along with state and local governments, has to fulfill this. But there has to be a lot more energy, a lot more training. We have 72 fusion centers, most of them very mature, very few officers having any training on how to handle intelligence or do warning intelligence, or look at or make sense out of suspicious activity reporting. Joe McNamara, a friend of mine at Los Angeles Police Department, has the best effort underway, and I'm pleased to see what she's doing. But we're early on this. My view is that this, again, is in the DNI's job jar and has to be addressed. We talk about it here at the Homeland Security Policy Institute and elsewhere, but we tend, because of American and because of the privacy, civil rights, civil liberty issues, I spent a lot of time worrying over that when I was at Homeland Security, but we cannot avoid dealing with the issue with straightforward and with courage, so that when I go and talk to a senator like Senator Feingold, he has confidence that what we're doing is right and lawful and is not an invasion of privacy of Americans.
I think that's spot on, and a finding we've debated tactics, and we haven't had this strategic discussion. Putting people in a very tough predicament if they're given that responsibility. And please wait, we do have a mic coming.
My name is Nawal Ziada. Interestingly enough, in 1913, on this very day, President Wilson said, no, the U.S. will never attack another country. If you were to sit in a room with the past, let's say, 5 presidents, what would you say to them, if any, would you give any advice?
The United States will never attack another country.
Another country, back in 1913 on this very day.
Yes, I know, and I do know that I believe Lord Grey said in 1914, as he stood in his window overlooking 10 Downing Street, the lights are going out all over Europe. If you've ever read that famous statement, and you know that. So attacking and not attacking, you have to make the right decisions. A government will protect its national interests. You only do a preemptive attack on another country when it's in your national interest. And my view is that I'm a great admirer of Wilsonian doctrine, but I'm also a great admirer of realpolitik, of the